So let's proceed to the basic statement of JavaScript before we start going deeper into JavaScript. Okay, so what is a statement and how do we make a statement? What are the different types of statements that we have in JavaScript? So JavaScript statements are instructions, right? So step-by-step instructions, just like we talked about in a programming language, right? A program is a set step-by-step instructions given to a computer, right? So in order to give your JavaScript execute a statement, right? So you need to give it an instructions, all right? So giving your logics, your syntax, they are all statements that you're trying to make, all right? So these statements are instructions that you're trying to let the browser execute. Okay, so statements are instructions that are executed by the browser. All right, so every bunch of syntax you type out on your JavaScript files, they are all statements that you're trying to make. And we have different types of statements that you can make. You can assign a value into a variable. We are going to talk about variable in a bit, so that you can get to understand how you can store data, how you can store different data types in a variable. All right, so we can make such statement by assigning values into a variable. We can also make some conditional statements compared to two or more values, two or more data, and if this condition is true, some bunch of statements, some bunch of logics can be executed, and if it's false, we can also fall back to a default statement. Okay, so we also have the loop conditional statement, so that is called repetitive. All right, so we can repeat a set of logic, a set of syntax, or a set of statements based on a certain condition. All right, so once that condition has been fulfilled, then your loop conditional statement stops. So we have different type of loop conditional statement that we can make. We can use the for loop, we can use the do loop, we can use the while loop. All right, so that's another type of statement that we can make. All right, so we are making those statements. You'll notice that we are using some special words, such as the let, such as the if, such as the for. All right, so these are called keywords. Okay, so keywords are reserved words, so they are reserved for that particular programming language. So every programming language has their special keywords. All right, and some of these programming language share similar keywords. Okay, for example, the if else switch and the for while do. All right, so they are peculiar to all programming languages. Okay, so what are those common keywords that we need in JavaScript? All right, so for our variable declaration, we need the let keyword, we need the const keyword, we need the var. All right, so we are going to talk about variables next in order to really understand how we can declare variables. Okay, but when we're trying to declare variables, we are going to use what? The let keyword and the const keyword. When we get there, we're going to talk about the difference between this let and the const keyword. Okay, for conditional statement that we make, we're going to be making use of the if, else, and the switch statements. All right, so these are the basic conditional statements in JavaScript. All right, so when you're trying to loop through a series of data, you make use of what? The for and the while and the do. Okay, so you also have your function related. All right, for creating your block of codes that are executed. All right, so these functions are block of codes that performs a particular task. All right, so for you to do that, you can use what? The function keyword and the return keyword as well. We also have our class related keywords, which is the class and the extend. For error handling, we use the try, catch, and throw. All right, so these are some of these special JavaScript keywords that are really important to take note of when programming in JavaScript, when making statements in JavaScript. All right, so let's dive into variables. What are variables? So let's just go to our JavaScript. All right, so I'm going to create some bunch of statements. All right, so welcome to JavaScript, and I'll say console.log hello, my name is John Doe. Okay, and we have console.log, right? And we have I love JavaScript. Yeah, everyone loves JavaScript. Okay, so okay, so I love JavaScript, and so it's John Doe. John Doe is 34 years of age. All right, so once we have written all of this data, right, we can preview that on our browser. All right, so let's refresh this. So we have welcome to JavaScript. Hello, my name is John Doe and I love JavaScript. John Doe is 34 years of age. Okay, so let's comment out this alert that keeps popping up because of the internal method. All right, so let's comment that out, so that we can focus majorly on this file. All right, so now what are we trying to do here? Right, we're trying to display some bunch of information about John Doe and JavaScript, which is a course. And you can see that we tend to repeat ourselves in terms of manually typing it out. Anytime we're trying to call out John Doe, we have to type it out. Anytime we are calling up JavaScript, we have to type it out. So if I want to call up JavaScript again, all right, we can say JavaScript is a high-level programming language. Okay, all right, so high-level programming language. So you can see that every time we want to call up JavaScript, anytime we want to call up John Doe, we get to type it out all the time. But what if we can store these particular data that we tend to reuse all the time? All right, what if we tend to store this data dynamically? Probably the user gets to type it out on a form, then this data is gotten from the HTML document, and we get to process it to display whatever message we want to display, right? What if that is the case? Okay, because typing it out may be a little bit frustrating. All right, so that is where variables comes in. So variable allows us to store data, all right, temporarily store data. All right, so why do we need to store data? Because we tend to reuse it all the time. So variables are memory and storage location. Okay, storage in location where we store data temporarily to use. So we have two major ways of storing data, of using variable, declaring variables in JavaScript. Okay, so we have the let keyword, we have the const keyword. The var keyword is an old method of storing variables. Okay, so now that we are on the ESX standard version of JavaScript, we make use of the let and the const keyword. All right, so let's do that. Let's quickly call up the let variable. So it's going to be let, so to declare your data, store data rather, in JavaScript, you need to call up the let, and you need an identifier. All right, an identifier to identify the value that you're trying to store. All right, so I'm going to call my identifier full name. All right, so I'm going to store a data called John Doe. So whenever we're trying to reference this name John Doe, we have to refer to what? Full name. So whenever we output full name, it's going to give us John Doe. All right, so let's also call up the age of John Doe, but this time around I'm going to use const, because we have two major ways. We can use what? The let keyword, and we have what? The const keyword. So I'm going to use the const age. Now declare that as let's say 34. Okay, so we also have let cost, or let's say let cost equal to, okay, sorry, alright, so let cost equal to let's say JavaScript. So that's going to be the course that John Doe loves. Okay, so yeah, so we've actually stored those particular data that can be gotten dynamically from the user, or we tend to reuse all the time. So instead of typing it out manually, we can just basically call up that variable identifier anytime we want that particular data. So what this is trying to do is that we are trying to store this value, all right, called John Doe, into this identifier called full name. So this equal to is known as the assignment operator. So you are assigning a value. All right, so this value is a data type, which we are going to talk about in a bit. All right, so this value called John Doe is being assigned to this variable name called full name. All right, so this 34, which is the age of the user, is being stored or is being assigned into this identifier age. Because JavaScript, all right, because JavaScript is also a value that is being assigned into this identifier, of course. All right, so how do we use it? So we have to replace these manual data with our variable identifiers. So we have to remove this JavaScript that we typed in manually, and we have to concatenate. Now when you're trying to join multiple strings together, it is called concatenation. So we make use of the plus sign to concatenate two or more values together. All right, we make use of the plus sign to concatenate two or more data. All right, so be it the string data type, or you're concatenating a string and a number data type, is still called concatenation. All right, so we are going to concatenate. We're going to join the full name together. So it's going to be what? Full name. So it's going to say welcome to, then it's going to pick out this John Doe as the value for the full name and output that to us. All right, so hello, my name. Okay, yeah, welcome to JavaScript. So we need to actually add the course, not the full name. All right, so it's going to be the course. So it's going to be welcome to JavaScript. All right, so we have my name is John Doe. So we need to replace this manual value by what? The identifier, which is the full name. All right, and it says I love JavaScript. So we also need to concatenate this. So I love, then the course rather. All right, so John Doe is 34 years of age, so we need to replace this as well. So just so let's call up the full name. All right, then plus, then this is a very a string data type, which we are still going to talk more about. So strings data type should be in quotation. All right, string data type should be in quotation. So when you're joining multiple strings together, you need to use the plus, which is the concatenation sign. All right, so that's the age, then the plus, then you call up your quotation. All right, so that should be double quote, not single quote. All right, so you have to get rid of one. All right, so this is how you concatenate strings together. All right, then we also have the course that should be added here. So let's also do that. So you have course plus, then yeah. So joining this together now, we are referencing from the data that we have stored in a variable. All right, instead of manually typing it out. So modifying this data becomes way more easier. So we look at that in a bit. So when you check this out and you refresh your browser, you'll see that you still have same set of results, right? But this time around, you're no longer typing in this data manually. You're storing this data inside a variable to be reused. Okay, so what that means is that I can decide to change John Doe to Mary Jane. All right, so Mary Jane. So anywhere this full name has been used in our source code, all right, gets automatically changed, all right, to be modified to Mary Jane. All right, so everywhere we have John Doe automatically gets replaced to Mary Jane. All right, so now what's the difference between this let variable and the const variable? All right, let's take a look at that.